the endocannabinoid system is arguably the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body. It contains a couple of neurotransmitters called anandamide and 2-AG. They affect some specific receptors called the CB1 and the CB2 receptors. The CB1 receptors are largely in the brain, but they can also be found elsewhere in the body. The CB2 receptors are largely in the immune system, and they too can be found elsewhere in the body. In addition to anandamide and 2-AG, the neurotransmitters, there are two enzymes that metabolize cannabinoids, both the endocannabinoids, endo meaning inside, and the phytocannabinoids, phyto meaning plant. Those enzymes are abbreviated FAAH, PA, and MGYL, Mygel, and they are important. Everybody's enzyme amounts and everybody's neurotransmitter amounts are different. So that's why cannabis can have different effects on different people. Cannabis has two important roles. One is homeostasis. Homeostasis is getting an organ system to run the way it's supposed to, sort of having it centered and focused. It's also important in terms of neuromodulation. That is, it controls the speed of neurotransmission, and that's why cannabis is so useful in treating migraine headaches or seizures, both of which are uncontrolled neurotransmissions. And by taking cannabis, you can slow down the speed of neurotransmission and help treat the migraines or help treat the seizures. The way in which cannabis controls neurotransmission is through a process called retrograde inhibition. In medicine, we make up words so nobody else can understand them. Retrograde inhibition just means that a neurotransmitter from the postsynaptic neuron comes backwards, retrograde, to the presynaptic neuron. And that neurotransmitter is an endocannabinoid. And what does that endocannabinoid do? It causes the release of dopamine. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter, and dopamine causes a exchange of electrolytes from inside the cell to outside the cell, and it depolarizes the cell. And that makes it harder for the next neural impulse coming along to stimulate that neuron. The reason that cannabis is helpful in terms of dealing with pain, I think, is at least twofold. One is that it slows down or decreases the frequency of pain stimuli that are being transmitted to your brain because it slowed the speed of neurotransmission. The other thing is that there are at least two pain interpretation centers in the brain. One that's mediated by your endorphins, your opiate-like molecule that your body makes, and the other one that's mediated by the endocannabinoids. So by increasing the amount of cannabinoids from an exogenous source that is outside your body, you're slowing down the speed of neurotransmission, and you're also influencing the pain interpretation center in the brain. And we know that from research that's been done and from other specialists in cannabinoid medicine, that most patients who have pain that try cannabis are able to decrease their dose of opiates by 30 to 50%, and in some cases not use it at all. Well, the reason that CBD contributes to pain relief is that it's an anti-inflammatory. And if you have osteoarthritis, which is inflammation of the bone, the CBD will decrease the inflammation. Now, normally your joints should sort of slide against each other like the cylinder in your engine slides up and down against the wall of the cylinder. But as you get older and you get more calcium deposits and more destruction in your joints, it's more like two pieces of heavy sandpaper rubbing against each other. And by taking the CBD, which is an anti-inflammatory, you get back closer to the smooth walls of the cylinder, and you have less sort of mechanical inflammation. And that mechanical inflammation that you have makes the inflammation that's there not only painful, but even worse. So the CBD is very helpful in terms of being an anti-inflammatory, and the THC is helpful in terms of being a pain reliever. Well, if we take a look at the work of two well-known addictionologists, Henningfield and Benowitz, they took a look at 5 or 6 recreational drugs: alcohol, heroin, tobacco, cocaine, coffee, and cannabis. The one that had the least dependency risk was cannabis, less than coffee. Can people die from marijuana? No.
Can people die from coffee? Yes. If go on the internet, you'll see that there were probably a couple of deaths in the United States last year from an overdose of caffeine. I know when I was in New Zealand that there was a report of an overdose death from caffeine. So caffeine is more dangerous than cannabis. So as soon as somebody starts talking about, well, cannabis is dangerous, say, well, are you going to talk about caffeine and the dangers that are inherent with caffeine?
You want to start with a low dose and only slowly increase the dose. And you want to know what you're doing. You want to listen to something like this. You want to read a book that somebody has written, hopefully one of my books. But you don't want to take a very high dose to begin with. There's no need to. The difference between using cannabis recreationally and using cannabis medicinally is fairly dramatic, because the goal in using cannabis recreationally is to get high, and often it's to get higher than a kite. That's not the goal when you're using cannabis medicinally. It's been illegal for the last 75 years because the oil companies were afraid of hemp, and because the legislators wanted to use it as a way of marginalizing Black and Hispanic people. It had nothing to do with its medicinal use, and that's why the American Medical Association testified aggressively against the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. So getting back to smoking, you don't have to smoke cannabis. You can take a tincture. One of the most historical ways of using it is in tea. Some people, some dispensaries have soft drinks that have been flavored with lemon or with coffee, and they've been spiked with cannabis. And they tell you, what percentage of THC there is in there, what the total amount of THC and CBD, sometimes CBN, sometimes CBG. So those are ways of using cannabis without smoking it.
I think the other thing that's very convincing is a number of people who tell me that they have decreased their reliance on prescription medication and or have actually stopped taking some of their prescription medications. Most people who have pain have a 30 to 50% decrease in their opiate dose, and some patients are able to stop using opiates altogether. And of course, the other thing that we know about cannabis is that it is extremely useful in terms of intervening in the opioid epidemic that we're having.